It began not with a sound, but with the theft of it. Across a million worlds, in the shielded choirs of the Scholastia Psychana and the echoing halls of navigator houses, a great silence fell. It was not the mere absence of noise, but a devouring void, a psychic anti-sound that clawed at the minds of all who could feel the tides of the Imperium. On Terra herself, within the Sanctum Imperialis, the effect was cataclysmic. The astropathic choir transcendent, a chorus of 1,000 souls bound in gestalt psychic communion, had for 10 millennia been a roaring ocean of thought, message, and prophecy. In a single horrifying moment, that ocean became a placid Dead Sea. The mental screams of the astropaths were silent, unable to find purchase in a reality that was suddenly unnaturally smooth. They clawed at their empty eye sockets, their minds reeling in a void more terrifying than any demonic vision, for it was a vision of nothing, absolute nothing. Deep beneath the palace, the change was felt as a physical blow. The great golden throne, that arcane and terrible engine of suffering, hummed with a new and discordant frequency. Its light, the divine radiance of the Astronomicon, flickered like a dying candle in a hurricane. For a full 3 seconds that stretched into an eternity, the signal that lit the galaxy wavered and died, plunging untold thousands of Imperial vessels into the maddening, unnavigable depths of the raw warp. The 10,000 companions of the Adeptus Custodes felt it not in their minds, for they were largely psychically null, but in the very fabric of the reality they were sworn to protect. It was as if a fundamental law of existence had been flippantly erased. The air grew cold. The golden light of the throne room seemed to lose its warmth, becoming a sterile chemical yellow. Tribunes and shield captains gripped their guardian spears, their ancient senses screaming that an enemy of unimaginable scale and reach had just struck a blow at the very heart of the Imperium, far beyond the grasp of the dying light. In the cold and silent dark between galaxies, the architect of this grand silence watched his work begin. Aboard his impossibly vast sepulchral vessel, the Song of Oblivion, the silent King Zarek sat upon the command throne of the Silent Kingdom. He felt no triumph, no malice, no emotion that the lesser races would recognize. There was only the cold, crystalline certainty of a grand equation reaching its final, elegant solution. Before him, a celestial orrery of captured stars and shimmering hard light holograms depicted the entire galaxy. As he initiated the final command, a silent wave of esoteric data flowed from his throne, a signal that was not energy nor psychic force, but a quantum command that rewrote physical law on a subatomic level. Across the galaxy, every shard of Noctilith, every Blackstone fortress, every dormant pylon and hidden tomb complex resonated in perfect, terrible harmony. On the orrery, 10,000 points of emerald light flared into existence, from the pariah nexus to the forgotten depths of the ghoul's stars, forming a web of absolute order that was beginning to constrict around the chaotic heart of the galaxy. His triarchal praetorians stood silent vigil, their soulless gaze fixed upon their king, the only being in creation who could conceive of such a gambit, to not merely cage the warp, but to unmake it, to drain the ocean of souls and leave behind a silent, sterile desert where the Necrontyr could finally be restored, without fear of demonic predation. The cost, the utter extinction of every psyker, the blinding of humanity, the death of all gods and souls, was, to his logic, not a cost at all, but a necessary and final cleansing. This silent tremor did not go unnoticed by the galaxy's oldest seers. On the craft world of Ulthwi, drifting through the void like a jewel of ancient sorrow, Farseer Eldrad Althran fell from his meditative trance with a strangled cry. The skeins of fate, the millionfold pathways of the future he had read for millennia, were not merely tangled or obscured, they were vanishing. He saw the great ocean of the warp, the sea of souls from which his people were born, and in which their doom was prophesied, begin to recede. It was draining away into a chasm of absolute blackness, leaving behind only the dead sediment of forgotten emotions and the fossilized bones of gods. He saw the blinding light of the Astronomicon sputter and die, and with it, the final hope of the human race. And he saw the cold emerald light of the Necron Empire rising to inherit a galaxy of dust and echoes. It was a future so bleak, so utterly devoid of life and spirit, that it made the victory of chaos seem like a preferable alternative. Even the great enemy felt the chill. In the realm of chaos, within the pestilent garden of Nurgle, Kugath Plaguefather ceased his stirring of a new celestial contagion. The very stuff of the Imperium around him felt thin, listless. The vibrant, churning energies of despair and entropy that gave him form and purpose felt sluggish, starved. It was a coldness he had not felt since the dawn of creation, a primal fear that struck at the very heart of his being. Deep within the brass citadel, Khorne's rage, for the first time in eternity, was tinged with something other than pure fury. It was a cold, sharp spike of alarm. The flow of mortal hatred and violence into his realm had lessened, not in a trickle, but as if a great dam had been erected. The eternal war was threatened not by peace or hope, but by an encroaching, absolute silence. On Terra, the emergency summons echoed through the halls of the Imperial Palace. The 12 High Lords gathered in the sanctum of the Senatorum Imperialis, their faces masks of grim disbelief. Reports flooded in from every corner of the segmentum solar. Astropathic choirs were silent or insane. The Navis Nobilite was in panic, their patriarchs reporting that the Emperor's light was a pale, flickering ghost. The Fabricator General of Mars spoke of anomalous, synchronous energy readings from every known Blackstone deposit, a resonance pattern that defied all known physics. Lord Commander Roboute Guilliman stood before the assembly, his gaze fixed on a tactical display showing 1,000 alerts of contact lost. The Avenging Sun, the master of logistics and strategy, saw the truth with chilling clarity. This was no natural disaster. It was not a new tear in the fabric of reality. This was a coordinated, galaxy-spanning attack by a foe of incomprehensible power. It was an act of war on a scale he had not witnessed since the Horus Heresy, a war not for territory or resources, but a war on the very soul of mankind. His voice, amplified by the chamber's acoustics, was cold iron. Mobilize the fleets, recall all crusade forces to coreward positions, sanction the Ordo Malleus to its highest authority. We are not just at war, we are fighting for our very right to exist in this galaxy. We will not be silenced. The final command had been given. The silent war had begun. Across the galaxy, two futures now stood in stark opposition. A vibrant, chaotic existence, eternally damned by the horrors of the warp, or a silent, ordered galaxy of soulless automatons. And in the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, the battle to decide which extinction was preferable had just commenced. In the immediate, chaotic hours following the Great Silence, the Imperium's response was not one of measured strategy, but of pure, reflexive fury. From the Phalanx, the indomitable fortress monastery of the Imperial Fists, to the storm-racked peaks of Fenris, Astartes' chapters scrambled their fleets. Yet it was the Black Templars, ever the tip of the Emperor's vengeful spear, who moved first. They required no counsel from Terra, no plea from beleaguered governors. Their High Marshal, Helbrecht, saw the dimming of the Astronomicon not as a crisis to be managed, but as a blasphemy to be purged. The fragmented dying screams of 1,000 astropaths, recorded and triangulated by Mechanicus Logi in the moments before the silence became absolute, pointed to a nexus of the unnatural calm, a previously uncharted system in the Segmentum Pacificus, designated only as Gethsemane. The crusade fleet Helbrecht gathered was a monument to faith and firepower. At its heart sailed the Eternal Crusader, a Gloriana-class battleship that had tasted the blood of the arch-traitors' fleets 10 millennia ago. It was a vessel whose very soul was steeped in righteous hatred. Flanking it were 6 battle barges, each a mobile fortress for the black-armored warriors of the Emperor's champion. Dozens of strike cruisers, hunter-class destroyers, and a cohort of Mechanicus arc cruisers from the allied forge world of Ryza formed the bulk of a fleet numbering over 100 capital-class vessels. It was a force capable of scouring a subsector clean, an embodiment of mankind's wrath made manifest in adamantium and ordnance. Their journey through the warp was a harrowing ordeal. The Emperor's light was a faint, unreliable whisper. Navigators clutched their heads and wept blood, guiding their vessels through sheer, desperate prayer as much as by skill. 3 escort frigates and a Dauntless-class light cruiser were lost to the now treacherous tides of the Imperium, their Geller fields failing and their crews claimed by the unblinking maw of chaos. They were the first casualties of the silent war, and they would not be the last. When the Crusade fleet translated back into real space at the Mandeville point of the Gethsemane system, what greeted them defied comprehension. There was no star, only a dead, lightless void where one should have been. and hanging in that void was the source of the silence, the blasphemy Helbrecht had come to destroy, the Noctilith crown. It was a construct of such impossible scale that it dwarfed the eternal crusader into insignificance. An immense ring of polished jet-black stone, its diameter wider than the orbit of a terrestrial world, surrounded the system's dead heart. Great pylons, each the size of a hive spire, studded its surface at precise intervals, pulsing with a faint, nauseating green light. It did not radiate energy in any detectable spectrum. Instead, it absorbed it, drinking in the light of distant stars and creating a palpable zone of absolute nullity. It was a celestial cage and a galactic amplifier, and its utter silence was a profound insult to the God Emperor. On the bridge of the Eternal Crusader, High Marshal Helbrecht stared at the chronocrystal display, his scarred face a mask of cold fury. "It is a tomb," he growled, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the deck plates. "The xenos have built a monument to their own damnation. We shall give them a fitting burial." The Imperial fleet advanced in battle formation, a spearhead of righteous steel aimed at the heart of the xenostructure. Vox channels crackled with prayers and oaths. Litanies of hate were broadcast on all frequencies, a tide of faith intended to wash away the unnatural stillness. The ship's machine spirit, ancient and bellicose, registered the Noctilith crown, but detected no power signatures, no crew, no life. It was, for all intents and purposes, inert. This only hardened the resolve of the Black Templars. They saw not a trap, but xenos arrogance, a belief that their profane works were beyond the reach of imperial retribution. "All vessels," Helbrecht commanded, his voice cutting through the rising chorus of prayers. "Prepare to fire on my mark. We will shatter this ring of stone and send a message to its creators. The Emperor's light cannot be extinguished." Deep within the Gethsemane void, hidden by cloaking technology that bent reality itself, the Necron fleet watched the primitives approach. On the command dais of the Nihilach tomb ship, golden sarcophagus and cryptecto Hulk, the stargazer observed the enemy fleet not as a warrior, but as a dispassionate scholar. He saw ships of crude, asymmetrical design, leaking radiation and belching plasma, propelled by barely controlled energies. He saw their clumsy maneuvering, their broadcasted shrieks of superstitious nonsense. They were biological chaos, a noisy, inefficient stain upon the purity of the void. His mandate from the Silent King was simple. The node at Gethsemane was to be protected at all costs. It was a critical amplifier for the final command, and its destruction would create a flaw in the grand resonance network. Hulk had arrayed the Gethsemane defense fleet in a perfect three-dimensional concentric kill zone. 30 Scythe-class harvest ships and a dozen Cairn-class tomb ships lay in phased stasis, utterly undetectable. He was not here to fight a battle of honor. He was here to conduct an extermination. Targeting solutions acquired, a Lichguard aide reported in a stream of binary glyphs. "The organics are entering the optimal eradication perimeter." Hulk made a minute gesture with one metallic finger. "Execute." Just as the weapon batteries of the Eternal Crusader began to glow with nascent power, reality fractured. Where there had been empty void, there was now a fleet. There was no flash of light, no dimensional tearing. One moment, there was nothing. The next, 42 Necron capital ships were present, their alien hulls of living metal shimmering with emerald light, arranged in a formation of such geometric perfection that it offended the eye. Before the Imperial fleet could even react, the Necrons fired. It was not a barrage, but a single galaxy-ending pulse of energy. Lightning arcs of incandescent green energy, vast and terrible, leaped from the Necron vessels. They did not travel like conventional lance beams. They simply were, connecting every Necron ship to multiple Imperial targets simultaneously. Void shields, the bedrock of naval warfare, overloaded and died in cascades of cerulean light. An Imperial sword-class frigate, caught between two arcs, was simply vaporized, its reactor core detonating in a silent flower of plasma that was immediately consumed by the emerald lightning. The bridge of the Eternal Crusader became a scene of pandemonium. Consoles exploded, servitors burst into flames. "Shields are gone, yet all forward shields are offline," a tech priest shrieked, his voice laced with static and terror. "We are being torn apart." A particle whip, a beam of accelerated atoms, struck the battle barge. Sigismund's fury, not piercing its hull but stripping it away layer by layer, peeling back a kilometer of adamantium plating in seconds and exposing the decks within to the hard vacuum. Thousands of Templars were vented into the void, their black armor freezing and tumbling in the silent dark. Helbrecht stood amidst the chaos, his knuckles white on the command throne's armrest. All his fury, all his faith felt like a child's tantrum in the face of this cold, silent execution. "Return fire," he roared. "Fire at will. Purge these abominations." The Imperial fleet, though crippled, responded with the defiant fury of the faithful. 1,000 macro-cannon batteries roared, filling the void with shells the size of hab blocks. Lance batteries spat beams of coherent light, but it was useless. The Necron hulls repaired themselves almost instantaneously, the living metal flowing like liquid mercury to seal any breaches. The shells that did hit seemed to have no effect, their explosive force absorbed by arcane defensive fields. The Necrons did not even deign to maneuver. They simply hung in the void, their weapons cycling with inhuman precision, dismembering the Imperial crusade piece by agonizing piece. And then, the Noctilith crown itself awoke. A section of the Great Ring began to glow, not with the green of Necron weaponry, but with a terrifying blackness, a hole in space that began to focus. A beam of pure silence, of anti-psychic energy made manifest, shot forth and struck the Eternal Crusader. The effect was not physical, but metaphysical. Every navigator on board screamed as their third eye withered into dust. The ship's astropaths, already silent, simply collapsed, their bodies turning to desiccated husks. Even the mighty machine's spirit, the accumulated consciousness of 10 millennia of war, let out a final psychic howl of agony that shattered every view screen on the bridge before it was extinguished. The Gloriana-class battleship was rendered utterly blind, deaf, and soulless. It was just a hunk of dead metal, adrift in a sea of its own dead. Helbrecht knew, with a certainty that froze his soul, that the battle was lost. More than that, he knew this was a war the Imperium did not understand. "Marshal," his seneschal stammered, blood pouring from his ears. "What are your orders?" Helbrecht looked at the tactical display, a sea of red icons representing destroyed Templar vessels. His crusade was annihilated, but the Imperium had to be warned. This was not a reawakened dynasty. This was something new, something final. "Break formation," he commanded, his voice devoid of its earlier fire replaced by a core of pure, cold adamantium. "All surviving ships, emergency translation. Get the word to Terra. Warn the Lord." His order was cut short as the forward third of the Eternal Crusader ceased to exist, erased from reality by the combined fire of 3 tomb ships. The remaining hulk of the legendary vessel drifted for a moment before its damaged plasma reactor finally went critical, erupting in a silent, brilliant starburst of white-hot energy. On the dais of the golden sarcophagus, Toholk the Stargazer watched the last Imperial ship vanish from his sensors. He made a notation in the ship's log, a simple, emotionless entry. Organic fleet designated hostile primus eradicated. System integrity at 100%. The great work continues. He then turned his attention back to the celestial orrery, dismissing the brief, noisy interruption from his thoughts entirely. In the Gethsemane system, there was only silence once more, a graveyard of drifting, frozen wreckage where a crusade had once burned with holy fire. The first blood had been spilled, and it had been spilled in a crushing, absolute, and silent defeat. The news of the Gethsemane annihilation did not arrive on Terra as a clear message, for the galaxy's throat had been cut. It came as a ghost, a single battered wreck that tore its way out of the immaterium on the very edge of the Sol system's outer patrol zone. It was the Cobra-class destroyer Solemn Vow, a ship so grievously wounded that its very presence in real space was a final act of defiance by its machine's spirit. Its hull was a latticework of melted armor and gaping wounds, its crew long dead from explosive decompression or the hard kill of vacuum. But its cogitator log banks, shielded by layers of blessed adamantium and faith, were intact. Within hours, its data screed was laid bare before the assembled High Lords of Terra in the Sanctum Imperialis. The silence in the chamber was heavier and more profound than the one now infecting the galaxy. They watched the final, horrifying picked records from the Eternal Crusader's bridge, saw the perfect geometric fleet of the xenos appear from nothing, and witnessed the dispassionate, silent slaughter of a Black Templar's crusade. They saw the Noctilith crown, a structure of impossible scale and malevolence, and they finally understood the nature of the weapon turned against them. Panic, cold and sharp, threatened to shatter the decorum of the ancient council. The Lord High Admiral, Corelia Serac, a woman whose family had commanded fleets since the Great Crusade, was ashen-faced. "An entire crusade fleet, erased in minutes," she whispered, the words barely audible. "Over 100 capital ships, 10,000 Astartes, gone. We have no weapon, no strategy to counter such a foe." The fabricator general of Mars, a monolithic figure of crimson robes and gleaming cybernetics, whirred with agitated binary cant. His optical sensors were fixed on the analysis of the Necron weaponry. "The energy signatures are an abomination of physics," he stated, his voice a synthesized rasp. "They do not pierce. They do not burn. They unmake. They violate the Omnissiah's divine laws of reality. And the structure, the Blackstone, it resonates with a harmony that our deepest augurs cannot comprehend. It is singing the death of our universe." But it was Roboute Guilliman who broke the spell of despair. He stood before the great tactical hololith of the galaxy, a giant of blue and gold amidst the cowed and terrified mortals. The picked feet of the Gethsemane slaughter played on a loop, a silent testament to their failure. He did not watch it. His eyes, ancient and weary, were already fixed on the solution. "This is not a war for territory," the Primarch declared, his voice cutting through the fear and filling the vast chamber. "This is not a war against a resurgent dynasty seeking to reclaim its old empire. That we could understand. That we could fight. This is a war of fundamental principles. The enemy seeks to impose a new reality upon the galaxy, a reality of absolute silence and order. They are not trying to conquer us. They are trying to delete us from existence." He gestured to the hololith, and the map of the galaxy shifted. Thousands of known Blackstone deposits, from the great pylons of Kadia's wreckage to forgotten monoliths on barren moons, began to glow with a sickly green light, all linked by faint shimmering lines of energy. The Noctilith crown was but one node in a galactic network. Helbrecht's crusade was not a battle. It was an exploratory probe that struck a hornet's nest. His sacrifice has shown us the scale of our enemy's design. Guilliman's gaze swept across the High Lords, his presence a force of sheer, indomitable will. "We cannot fight this war with a single hammer blow. The enemy is everywhere and nowhere. We must therefore fight on two fronts, with two distinct crusades, one of light and one of shadows." He raised a gauntleted hand, and a new fleet icon appeared, forming over the segmentum solar. It was vast, an armada of unprecedented scale. "The first I shall designate Crusade Fleet Quintus. Its mission will be one of purgation. It will be the largest single military mobilization since the Great Crusade. We will strip our garrisons. We will empty our reserves. We will muster every battle-ready regiment of the Astra Militarum, every Night House sworn to Terra, and every Titan Legion that can be roused. This fleet will not be subtle. It will be a storm of iron and fury, and its singular purpose will be to move from one Blackstone node to the next and shatter them into dust. It will be a war of unimaginable attrition. We will bleed, and we will die in numbers that will make the history of the Imperium seem like a prelude. But we will buy time." He then pointed to a figure standing in the shadows of the chamber, a man who had not yet spoken, but whose presence was an anchor of stability in the room, Lord Solar Leontis. "Lord Solar," Guilliman commanded, "you will take command of Crusade Fleet Quintus. Your war will be one of mathematics and slaughter. You will drown the xenos in the blood of martyrs until their silent machine falters." Leontis stepped forward, his uniform immaculate, his face a calm, determined mask. He looked not at the Primarch, but at the hololith, at the thousands of green nodes that represented his targets. "It will be done, Lord Regent," he said, his voice steady. The simplicity of his acceptance was more profound than any bombastic oath. Guilliman nodded, then turned his attention back to the council. "But this hammer blow, however mighty, will not win the war. It will only delay our extinction. While the Lord Solar fights his war of attrition, we must strike at the enemy's mind. We must locate the source of the final command, the central locus from which the Silent King orchestrates his grand design. This is not a mission for armies." As he spoke, the golden doors of the sanctum opened, and two figures entered. The first was Captain General Trajan Valoris, his auramite armor shimmering, his gaze holding the weight of 10,000 years of vigil. The second was a giant in gray ceramite, his psychic hood crackling with contained power, Kaldor Drago, the returned supreme Grand Master of the Grey Knights, a figure of myth pulled from the warp by the sheer desperation of the hour. This second force, Guilliman continued, his voice now a low, serious tone, will be a scalpel of unparalleled sharpness. It will be comprised of the Adeptus Custodes, for their will is incorruptible, and the Grey Knights of Titan, for their souls are anathema to the unnatural. They will hunt where Crusade Fleet Quintus cannot go. They will move like ghosts, seeking the origin of the silent plague. They will find the silent king, and they will cut the head from the serpent. A new kind of silence descended upon the chamber, one of awe and terror, to commit the Emperor's own guardians in the secretive. From the command throne of the Tetrarch's sword, a vessel that had once served as a Tetrarch of Ultramar's personal flagship, Lord Solar Leontis surveyed the grand tapestry of his war. Before him, the tactical hololith was not a map of stars, but a complex, multi-layered schematic of the Blackstone resonance network. It was a web of galactic scale, and his task was to tear it apart, one thread at a time. The augur data, compiled from 1,000 different sources and sanctified by the highest orders of the Adeptus Mechanicus, was clear. While great fortresses like the Noctilith Crown were the obvious keystones, the true strength of the Silent King's design lay in its redundancy. Innumerable smaller nodes, many hidden on unsuspecting Imperial worlds, acted as amplifiers and relays, strengthening the psychic silence and making the network resilient to singular, decisive strikes. His first target could not be a fortress. That would be a fool's errand, a repeat of Helbrecht's disastrous crusade. His first target had to be a world that was both strategically critical and, by Imperial standards, utterly expendable. The choice, determined by the cold arithmetic of galactic survival, was the agri-world of Viridia, designated Viridia 4 in the Administratum's ledgers. It was the breadbasket of the Argolis subsector, a world of rolling golden plains, meticulously cultivated fungal farms, and weather control stations that ensured perpetual harvest. Its continents were vast, uninterrupted fields of grain, its people a hardy, pious stock who knew little beyond the Emperor's prayer and the turn of the seasons. For millennia, Viridia had been a symbol of the Imperium's mundane, life-giving foundation. But deep beneath its fertile soil, unknown to the tithe collectors and planetary governors, lay a latticework of Blackstone deposits, a sleeping geological cancer that the final command had now awoken. Viridia was no longer a farm. It was a psychic amplifier of the First Order, its position in the segmentum tempestus turning it into a critical linchpin that focused the silent resonance towards the eastern fringe. For Leontis, the equation was simple and brutal. Viridia's 10 billion souls and its vital food production were secondary to its role in the enemy's grand machine. It had to be broken, but the Necrons had reached the same conclusion. Before Crusade Fleet Quintus could even complete its mustering, the silent conquest of Viridia had begun. It did not come with fire and thunder. One day, the great grain fields swayed under the twin suns. The next, the ground itself began to heave and split. From beneath the black soil, great monoliths of obsidian stone rose with geological slowness, their surfaces humming with an energy that caused the crops around them to wither and turn to gray dust. The people of Viridia, their faith simple and absolute, at first thought it was a sign from the God Emperor. They gathered at the feet of the strange pylons, offering prayers. Their answer came not from the heavens, but from the earth. Canoptek scarabs, swarms of metallic, beetle-like constructs, poured from fissures in the monolith spaces. They did not attack the people. They consumed the harvest, devouring entire continents of grain in a matter of hours, turning the golden world into a barren gray desert. Then came the harvest of the people. Ghostly crescent-shaped ships, Necron night scythes, descended from the silent sky. Green beams of light lanced down, and where they touched, life simply ended. There were no screams, no explosions. One moment a farmer stood in his field, his family beside him. The next, there was only a patch of blackened glass and the faint smell of ozone. The Necrons were not conquering Viridia, they were sterilizing it. When the vanguard of Crusade Fleet Quintus arrived, it was to a scene of quiet, systematic extermination. The verdant globe Leontis had seen on his charts was now a mottled canvas of green and gray. From orbit, the scale of the Imperial response was breathtaking. The sky over Viridia's primary continent, once blue, was torn asunder by 1,000 fiery contrails. Drop pods from a half-dozen Space Marine chapters, including the stoic Imperial Fists and the zealous Fire Lords, slammed into the planet's surface like meteorites, their occupants deploying to establish beachheads. They were followed by the true weight of the Imperial Guard. Colossal troop landers, each the size of a city block, descended through the atmosphere, their undersides glowing cherry red. From their cavernous holds poured the might of the Astra Militarum, the grim Cadian shock troops, the disciplined Mordian Iron Guard, the stoic Valhallan Ice Warriors. 1,000,000 men and 10,000 tanks hit the ground in the first hour alone, a tide of humanity intended to overwhelm the silent xenos through sheer numbers and righteous fury. The battle for Viridia began in the Dust Bowl that had once been the plains of St. Valerius. The Necrons met the Imperial assault not with a charge, but with a silent, implacable advance. Phalanxes of Necron warriors, their metallic bodies gleaming under the sickly green light of the monoliths, marched in perfect unison. Their Gauss flares spat emerald bolts of energy that did not burn or pierce, but stripped their targets apart atom by atom. A lasgun beam, the ubiquitous weapon of the Imperial Guard, would splash harmlessly against their living metal bodies, the damage repairing itself in a shimmer of light before the guardsmen could even fire a second shot. Lehman Russ battle tanks, the workhorses of the Imperial war machine, found their shells detonating uselessly against unseen energy shields, only to be dismantled moments later by the heavy Gauss destructors of hovering annihilation barges. It was a slaughter. The first wave of the Imperial Guard was cut to pieces, their courage and faith utterly meaningless against the cold, calculated efficiency of the Necron war machine. Commissars executed retreating men, their bolt pistols echoing in the sudden silence as entire platoons were flayed from existence. The Space Marines fared better, their bolter rounds capable of shattering Necron bodies and their Terminator plate withstanding the worst of the Gauss fire. An Ultramarines assault squad, led by a battle-hardened captain, managed to plant a teleport homer at the base of a lesser monolith. For a glorious, fleeting moment, victory seemed possible as 5 squads of Terminators teleported directly into the heart of the Necron lines. They laid about them with thunderhammers and storm shields, crushing Necron skulls and shattering metallic spines. But then the Necrons adapted. Canoptech wraiths phasing in and out of reality sliced through Terminator armor as if it were paper. A towering Triarch stalker impaled the Ultramarine captain on its massive forelimbs, its multifaceted islands glowing with cold indifference as the Primarch's sun was extinguished. From his orbital throne, Lord Solar Leontis watched the casualty reports stream in, the numbers climbing into the hundreds of thousands within the first day. The planet was a charnel house, a crucible where faith and flesh were being rendered down by a soulless machine. But he saw something else. He saw that for every 10 guardsmen who fell, another 100 took their place. For every tank that was unmade, 3 more rumbled out of the landers. He saw the Imperial fists ignoring the battle raging around them, already constructing vast fortress lines, digging trenches that stretched for hundreds of kilometers, turning the barren plains into a mirror of the siege works of Terra. The Necrons were efficient, but they were finite. The Imperium's greatest weapon had always been its limitless supply of martyrs. The grinding planet-wide war of attrition he had foreseen had begun. Viridia was no longer a world. It was a meat grinder, a vast open grave into which he would pour the lives of millions of men, all to buy the rest of the galaxy, a few more precious seconds of existence. The battle was not being won, but the war had been joined. Viridia, the breadbasket of the Argolis subsector, was now the crucible of faith, and its price would be paid in blood and souls. In the second month of the Viridian campaign, the war had devolved into a state of brutal, grinding stasis. The verdant world was gone, replaced by a universal landscape of gray dust and cratered earth, a vast network of Imperial trenches and fortifications facing an equally vast and silent Necron line. The conflict had become a monstrous parody of the ancient wars of Terra's past, a siege on a planetary scale. Every day, the Imperial Guard would launch massive human wave assaults against the Necron phalanxes, sending hundreds of thousands of men over the top of their trenchworks, their bayonets fixed and their throats raw from screaming litanies. And every day, they would be scythed down by the merciless emerald fusillade of Gauss fire. The ground between the two armies, a no-man's land kilometers wide, was not littered with bodies. It was a shimmering field of atomized dust, the constituent particles of millions of brave soldiers. Victories were measured in meters gained, paid for with the lives of entire regiments. Morale, the lifeblood of the Astra Militarum, was beginning to hemorrhage. The command staff of Crusade Fleet Quintus, orbiting high above the slaughter, grew desperate. Lord Solar Leontis, grim-faced and sleepless, was besieged by his own generals. Marshals from the Krieg Death Corps argued for the deployment of cyclonic torpedoes, willing to sacrifice the planet and their own men for a swift conclusion. Lord Generals from the Talarn Desert Raiders proposed vast flanking maneuvers that were impossible on a featureless global battlefield. Even the Astartes commanders, their superhuman resolve tested to its limit, could offer no solution but to redouble their bloody assaults. The Necron war machine was simply too resilient, too implacable. Their numbers seemed endless, fresh legions rising from newly unearthed tombs each day, their fallen warriors teleporting back to their crypts for repair, only to return to the front lines hours later. They were fighting an enemy that could not be broken, could not be demoralized, and could not, it seemed, be truly killed. It was in the darkest hour of this strategic mire that a new legend was forged, not in the gilded halls of command, but in the blood and mud of the front line. The Cadian 301st, a regiment of white shields and raw recruits, hastily conscripted after the fall of their homeworld, held a sector of the front designated the Razor. It was a salient, a bulge in the Imperial line that jutted precariously into Necron territory, and it was assaulted relentlessly. Its commander, Lord General Katerin Valerius, was a woman forged in the fires of Cadia's fall. She had seen her world die, had witnessed the great rift tear the sky asunder, and it had not broken her. It had tempered her faith into a weapon of adamantium hardness. While other generals saw only a war of attrition, Valerius saw a war of faith. She understood that she could not outfight the Necrons, so she resolved to outlast them, to prove that the human spirit was more resilient than their living metal. Her strategy was a radical departure from the brutal frontal assaults favored by the High Command. She ordered her men to dig, not just trenches, but a deep labyrinthine network of bunkers, kill zones, and subterranean corridors that turned the Razor into a fortress burrowed into the planet's crust. She repurposed the wreckage of Lehman Russ tanks into fortified pillboxes. She had her engineers jury-rig massive arrays of voxcasters, not for orders, but to blast hymns and prayers into the silent no-man's land, an act of sheer defiant noise against the enemy's silence. Her orders were simple and repeated at every briefing. You do not need to kill them. You only need to refuse to die. Hold the line. The Emperor watches. When the Necron assaults came, the Cadian 301st did not meet them in the open. They fell back into their tunnels, drawing the soulless machines into a claustrophobic maze of death. They detonated hidden mines, collapsed tunnels on entire phalanxes, and used flamers to turn corridors into incandescent tombs. They fought with a ferocity born of utter desperation and unwavering faith, a faith embodied by their commander. Lord General Valerius led from the front, a gesture almost unheard of in the upper echelons of the Guard. She moved through the trenches, her Cadian pattern command coat caked with dust, a power sword in one hand and a rosarius clutched in the other. She did not shout bombastic speeches. She spoke to her soldiers, shared their meager rations, and led them in prayer under the pale, dying light of the Astronomicon. She possessed a tactical genius that was both innate and unconventional. She noticed that the Necrons, for all their technological might, were predictable. Their logic was their weakness. She would deliberately sacrifice a forward trench, letting the Necrons advance into it, only to have pre-sighted basilisk artillery batteries hidden miles behind the lines obliterate the position with pinpoint accuracy. She turned their own implacable advance into a weapon against them. Slowly, miraculously, the tide in the Razor sector began to turn. The Cadian 301st was not advancing, but they had stopped dying. They were holding. Her legend was cemented during the battle for Hill 909, a key observation post that gave the Necrons a commanding view of the entire Razor salient. A force of Triarch Praetorians, the elite guard of the Necron nobility, had seized the hill in a lightning-fast aerial assault. An immediate counterattack by a company of Mordian Iron Guard was annihilated. The situation was critical. Valerius, against the advice of her entire staff, gathered what remained of her command squad and a platoon of Kasserkin shock troops. "Faith is the only shield that cannot be broken," she declared over the vox, her voice calm and clear amidst the crackle of battle. "I will show you." She led the charge up the hill herself, her rosarius glowing with a brilliant golden light. It was a suicide run, a fool's gambit. But as she charged, a strange and potent miracle occurred. The Gauss fire of the Praetorians seemed to part around her, the emerald bolts dissipating harmlessly against the shimmering field of her faith. The guardsmen following in her wake, their souls set ablaze by the sight of this divine protection, charged with a ferocity that bordered on madness. They crashed into the line of elite xenos, fighting not with tactics, but with pure, righteous fury. Valerius herself met the Necron overlord in single combat, her power sword clashing against his war scythe in a shower of sparks. She was no Astartes, but her every blow was guided by a faith so powerful it became a physical force. She shattered the overlord's metallic body, and with his fall the remaining Praetorians faltered, their command protocols momentarily broken. The Kasrkin exploited the opening, cutting them down with volleys of hotshot les-fire. By Hill 909 was retaken. Word of the Saint of the Razors spread like wildfire through the Imperial lines. Picked captures of her charge, her Rosarius blazing like a star, were disseminated across the guard Voxnet. Soldiers from 100 different worlds, their spirits ground down by the endless slaughter, found a new icon to rally behind. The hymns from the Razor sector were picked up and repeated along the entire front. Valerius, through her tactical brilliance and sheer unyielding fanaticism, had done the impossible. She had given the Imperial Guard hope. Lord Solar Leontis, observing from orbit, recognized the strategic value of this nascent legend. He redirected the best regiments, the most potent artillery, and a full detachment of Sisters of Battle to reinforce Valerius's sector. He did not care if her protection was a genuine miracle or a freak psychic event. He cared only that it worked. Katerin Valerius had become more than a general. She was now the soul of the Viridian campaign, a living symbol of humanity's will to endure against the coming silent night. And in a war against an enemy without souls, that was the most powerful weapon in the Imperium's arsenal. High above the charnel house of Viridia, aboard the Song of Oblivion, the Silent King watched the unfolding war with an analytical detachment that bordered on disinterest. The reports from the Viridian overlord were precise and logical. Imperial resistance, while statistically insignificant in the grand scheme of the final command, had proven more resilient than initial projections suggested. The emergence of the human commander, Valerius, was a variable his cryptechs were still analyzing. Her inexplicable defensive field was a localized anomaly in reality, a bubble of improbable survival that defied known physical laws. It was a chaotic, unpredictable element, and Zarek detested chaos. Yet, he was not concerned. The war on Viridia was a minor distraction, a localized infection in a body he was already euthanizing. The Imperium's entire strategy, this crusade fleet Quintus, was a flawed concept, a predictable reaction from a species that still thought wars were won by conquering planets. The true war was being fought in the silent, cold spaces between worlds. The Imperium, in its blind, brute force approach, was beginning to adapt. Leontis, guided by the improbable legend of Katerin Valerius, was now consolidating his forces, turning the Viridian campaign from a war of conquest into a war of containment. Smaller, faster strike fleets were being dispatched from the main body of Crusade Fleet Quintus, targeting the lesser Blackstone nodes that Viridia amplified. The Imperial Navy was learning. They avoided direct fleet engagements, instead using hit-and-run tactics, launching cyclonic torpedoes from extreme range, and then making emergency warp jumps before the Necron fleets could respond. They were sacrificing ships at an alarming rate, but they were succeeding in shattering the more vulnerable, less defended resonance points. The grand web of the final command was beginning to show the first, minute phrase at its edges. The galaxy-wide silence was now punctuated by brief, agonizing moments of psychic static. It was intolerable. Zarek knew it was time to remind the primitives of the futility of their struggle. It was time to demonstrate that their fleets, their courage, and their precious martyrs were nothing more than fleeting distractions in a war they could not even comprehend. From his command throne, he issued a new directive, a stream of complex command runes that flowed across the galaxy to a hidden tomb complex nestled within a nebula of dying stars. He awakened one of his dynasty's most terrible and ancient weapons, a relic from the war in heaven so potent that its use risked tearing the fabric of reality as much as it did the enemy. He unleashed the world engine. This was not one of the lesser planetoid-sized fortresses that the Imperium had occasionally encountered and through immense sacrifice defeated. This was a true world engine, a machine planet designated Chronomaster's Ire. It was a globe of polished black metal, larger than Mars, its surface devoid of any features save for a single colossal energy cannon at its northern pole and a latticework of shimmering green lines that pulsed with temporal energy. It was not merely a warship, it was a mobile fortress tomb and a temporal weapon combined. Its master, the ancient Necron overlord Orican the Diviner, in his elevated state as a chronomaster, had been integrated into its core systems, his consciousness now guiding the planet-sized engine of destruction. The world engine did not travel through the warp, for it had no need of such crude and chaotic methods. It simply folded space, as appearing at its destination in an instant. Its first target was the Imperial Navy battle group designated Task Force Solarian, a fleet of 30 cruisers and 50 escorts en route to strike a Blackstone node in the Orpheus sector. They were traveling at the edge of the now flickering light of the Astronomicon, their navigators straining to hold a steady course. One moment, they were in the empty void of interstellar space. The next, their augurs and sensors screamed in unison. A planetary body had appeared from nowhere, directly in their path. Before the fleet commander, Admiral Justian, could even issue an order, the attack began. It was not a volley of weapons. It was a wave of pure temporal distortion that radiated from the Chronomaster's Ire. Aboard the bridge of the Admiral's flagship, the lunar-class cruiser Righteous Fury, the crew watched in horror as the Dauntless-class light cruiser Stalwart was caught at the edge of the wave. The ship did not explode. It aged. In the space of 5 seconds, the crew of the Righteous Fury saw 10,000 years pass for the Stalwart. They saw its adamantium hull corrode and rust, its colors fading, its structure groaning and buckling under the weight of millennia of metal fatigue. They saw the flickering lights within its viewports die out one by one. The ship drifted past them, a ghost ship, a relic from a forgotten age, its crew long since turned to dust, its systems inert. Then the wave hit the Righteous Fury. Time became a fractured, horrifying nightmare. One crewman would be frozen in a single moment, a statue of flesh and blood, while the man next to him would age into a withered corpse and crumble to the deck. A servitor would revert to the screaming, terrified man he had been before his lobotomization, only to then rapidly decay into a skeleton. Bulkheads would shift between pristine condition and rusted-out wrecks. Admiral Justian felt his own body flicker, his skin wrinkling and his bones aching with arthritis one moment, then becoming smooth and young the next. The temporal field was not uniform. It was a chaotic storm of chronoton particles that made a mockery of linear existence. As the Imperial fleet reeled in temporal chaos, unable to fight or flee, the world engine fired its primary weapon. From its pole, the beam of impossibly bright emerald energy lanced out. It did not carry heat or kinetic force. It carried the weight of eons. The beam struck the Gothic-class cruiser. Hammer of Faith. The ship and its 10,000 crew were instantly and utterly erased from the timeline. They had not been destroyed. They had been made to have never existed. Their past, present, and future were consumed in a single silent flash. There was no wreckage, no energy signature, no echo in the warp. There was only a void where a warship had been a moment before. The remnants of Task Force Solarian, their ships and crews ravaged by the temporal distortions, tried to scatter. It was futile. The Chronomaster's Ire was relentless, its primary weapon firing with cold precision, each shot erasing another Imperial vessel from history. A few ships at the very edge of the temporal field managed to engage their warp drives. They did not escape. Their navigators, their sense of time already shattered, opened rifts into 1,000 different pasts and futures. One frigate vanished, only to reappear a moment later as a 1,000-year-old battle-scarred wreck from some forgotten war that had not yet been fought. Another simply imploded as its Geller field failed, its past and future selves collapsing into the same point in space-time. Within an hour, Task Force Solarian was gone. All that remained was a handful of drifting ancient hulks, their surfaces pitted with micro-asteroids accumulated over centuries they had never truly lived through. The Chronomaster's Ire did not linger. Its work done, it folded space and vanished, leaving behind a silent graveyard of temporal paradoxes. The destruction of Task Force Solarian was a blow from which Crusade Fleet Quintus could not easily recover. It was not the loss of ships that was so devastating. It was the psychological impact. How could they fight an enemy who could kill them yesterday? How could they plan a strategy against a foe who could erase their victories from the timeline before they were even 1. The world engine began to hunt, a specter of temporal doom stalking the fleets of the Imperium. It would appear without warning, annihilate a battle group, and vanish, leaving behind only impossible wreckage and a crippling existential dread. Sarek's message had been delivered. The Imperium's grand strategy was shattered. They were not fighting a war. They were simply an anomaly to be corrected, a noisy error in the Silent King's perfect silent equation. While the Imperium grappled with the existential terror of the Chronomaster's ire in the void, a far more insidious and devastating blow was about to be struck from within its own heartlands. The Adeptus Mechanicus, the monolithic cult of the machine god, had always been an empire within an empire, its faith and loyalties a complex and often contradictory web of dogma and data. The Great Silence and the revelation of the Necrons' grand design had not unified the priesthood of Mars. It had shattered it along ancient, barely healed fault lines. For millennia, the official dogma dictated by the Fabricator General on Mars was that the xenos technology of the Necrontyr was anathema, a profane mockery of the Omnissiah's divine machine. But there had always been whispers, heretical sects who saw in the Necrons' perfect, soulless machinery not a mockery but an ideal. They saw a future free from the weakness of the flesh and the chaotic, illogical whims of the warp. This schism found its ultimate expression on the forge world of Jau Arkad. A planet of blackened steel and smog-choked skies, Jau Arkad was renowned for its mastery of esoteric data weavery and quantum-entangled communication networks. Its ruling fabricator locum, a centuries-old archmagos named Kelbor Hal 2.71, had long been the secret leader of a radical sect known as the Logicians of the Void Dragon's Shard. They believed that the Emperor was a false idol and the Omnissiah was not a god, but a universal principle of pure, cold logic. They had studied the fragmented data recovered from the Cetan Shard imprisoned on Mars, and had come to a terrifying conclusion. The Immaterium was a fundamental flaw in creation, a chaotic anomaly that prevented reality from achieving its perfect, final state of ordered silence. In the Silent King's final command, Kelbor Hal and his logicians saw not a threat, but the fulfillment of their deepest theological desires. It was the ultimate expression of the Omnissiah's will, the scouring of all illogical, chaotic data, souls, emotions, gods, from the galactic hard drive. As Crusade Fleet Quintus bled on Viridia, and the Chronomaster's ire hunted in the void, Kelbor Hal made his move. The schism was not declared with a broadcast or a proclamation. It began with a single, silent stream of scrap code, a weaponized data virus of unparalleled complexity, unleashed from the core cogitator shrines of Jau Arkad. This was not a crude virus designed to overload systems or cause reactors to fail. This was a heresy of logic, a code that targeted not machines, but the very dogma that bound the Adeptus Mechanicus to the Imperium. It propagated through the Mechanicus' own noospheric data sphere, carried on the back of prayers and maintenance litanies. When it infected a tech priest, it did not corrupt them. It converted them. It presented its argument with irrefutable cold logic, showing them the statistical certainty of the Imperium's decay, the mathematical inefficiency of faith, and the elegant final solution offered by the Necrons. It was a virus that killed faith and replaced it with a terrifying nihilistic certainty. The effect was cataclysmic. Across the entire Segmentum Pacificus, Forge worlds fell silent, not because they were destroyed, but because they had changed allegiance. On the vital Forge world of Griffin F4, the Scutarii legions, their minds now slave to the new logic, turned their radium carbines on the Imperial Guard regiments garrisoned there, slaughtering them in a silent, efficient purge. The Titan legions stationed on the planet, the mighty Legio Griffonicus, found their princeps' thrones infected. The god machines, once loyal symbols of the Imperium's might, knelt in unison, their war horns silent for the first time in 10 millennia, awaiting new orders not from Mars, but from Jau Arkad. The fleets of the Battle Fleet Pacificus, heavily reliant on Mechanicus support, were crippled overnight. Ships found their engines unresponsive, their weapons systems locked, their life support systems venting into the void, all controlled by Magi and engine seers who now served a new, silent master. The physical betrayal was just as devastating. From the continent-sized shipyards of Jau Arkad, a new fleet emerged. It was a horrifying amalgamation of Imperial and Necron design principles. The familiar Gothic prows of lunar cruisers were now augmented with living metal plating that rippled and repaired itself. The broadsides of battleships were retrofitted with captured Gauss weaponry, their lance turrets replaced with energy cannons that fired beams of pure temporal distortion, a lesser but still terrifying imitation of the Chronomaster's ire. These hybrid vessels, crewed by Skitarii legions whose flesh had been entirely replaced with gleaming chrome and whose minds were now little more than nodes in a single unified consciousness, fell upon the loyalist imperial worlds of the sector. They did not conquer, they did not demand surrender. They simply sterilized, their logic dictating that the inefficient biological matter of the Imperium was a contamination to be cleansed. On Mars, the Fabricator General was faced with a crisis that threatened to sunder his entire order. The scrap code of the logicians was a digital plague, and he was forced to enact the ultimate sanction, the Severance Protocol. He ordered the complete isolation of the Martian noosphere from the rest of the galaxy, cutting off vast swaths of the Mechanicus from the throne world's guidance and data flow. It was a desperate, self-mutilating act, like a man cutting off his own limb to stop the spread of gangrene. The Adeptus Mechanicus, the technological soul of the Imperium, was now fractured into 100 warring sects, loyalists fighting schismatics across 1,000 worlds. The logistical support for Crusade Fleet Quintus, already strained to its breaking point, completely collapsed. Ammunition shipments ceased. Replacement parts for damaged vehicles were no longer forged. The very flow of promethium and plasma that fueled the Imperial war machine was choked off. Roboute Guilliman, receiving the news in his sanctum on Terra, felt a cold dread he had not known since the darkest days of the heresy. This was a betrayal on a scale that rivaled that of Horus's rebellion. It was not a betrayal born of ambition or corruption, but of a cold alien logic that he could not reason with or intimidate. The war was no longer a clear-cut struggle against an external xenos threat. It was now a three-front war, a war of attrition on Viridia, a war of terror in the void, and a bitter, soul-destroying civil war against the very priests who maintained the Imperium's machines. The schism of Mars had done more damage than 1,000 Necron legions. It had poisoned the Imperium's blood and turned its own strength against itself. The path to victory, already narrow and treacherous, had now all but vanished, replaced by a complex, multifaceted equation of damnation where every possible outcome led to ruin. The schism of Mars was not a single shattering blow, but the severing of the Imperium's arteries. The consequences bled out across the galaxy, a slow, systemic exsanguination that was felt in every war zone and on every beleaguered world. For the first time in 10 millennia, the vast continent-spanning manufactorums of the Segmentum Pacificus fell silent. The rhythmic, planet-shaking hammer blows of industry ceased, replaced by an eerie quiet. The logistical chains that bound the Imperium together, a fragile miracle of administration and blind faith, began to snap, one by one. Crusade Fleet Quintus, still locked in its bloody embrace with the Necrons on Viridia, was the first to feel the true cost of this new war. Ships that had once been guaranteed resupply found their rendezvous points empty. Munitions reserves dwindled from mountains to hills, then to carefully rationed handfuls of shells. On the surface of Viridia, the Lehman Russ tanks of the Astra Militarum, once the iron backbone of the Imperial advance, began to fall silent, their fuel tanks dry, their ammunition racks empty. They were turned into static pillboxes, their crews fighting with laser guns and bayonets from their silent steel tombs until they were inevitably overwhelmed. The dimming of the Astronomicon now combined with the logistical collapse to create a new and terrifying reality for the Imperium. It was no longer a contiguous empire, but a series of isolated islands of light in an ever-expanding ocean of darkness and silence. Warp travel, already a perilous gamble, became a near impossibility. A journey that might have taken weeks now took months, if it could be made at all. Navigators, their minds already strained by the muted psychic beacon of Terra, now had to contend with the silent zones created by the Blackstone network, vast swathes of space where the immaterium was unnaturally calm, offering no currents to guide their way. Entire subsectors went dark. Governors pleaded for aid that would never come. Tithe fleets laden with the men and materials that were the lifeblood of the Imperium vanished without a trace, lost in the silent dark or falling prey to the hybrid fleets of Zhao Arkad. The Imperium was being dismembered in the dark, its limbs severed from its body, unable to even scream as it was torn apart. On Terra, the weight of this galactic collapse was a palpable presence. The High Lords of Terra, rulers of 1,000,000 worlds, now presided over a shrinking map. Every day, Lord Commander Guilliman was presented with a new list of lost worlds and silent sectors. The numbers were staggering, defying comprehension. Billions of souls cut off from the Emperor's light were now at the mercy of orcs, Drukhari pirates, or the insidious tendrils of chaos cults that thrived in the growing despair. But worse than the xenos or the heretic was the silence. Worlds did not fall in fire and fury. They simply ceased to be. Their astropathic signals would flicker, then die. Their last tithe ship would be recorded as overdue, then lost, and then there would be nothing. It was a slow, bureaucratic apocalypse, recorded in the ledgers of administratum scribes who tallied the death of worlds with the scratch of a quill. The human cost was a litany of unending horror. The Cadian 301st on Viridia, deprived of reinforcements and resupply, began to fortify their trenches with the bodies of their own fallen, their faith the only resource that was not yet depleted. In the besieged hive cities of Armageddon, the orc population, unchecked by the now absent Imperial fleets, exploded, and a new war for Armageddon began, a war the rest of the galaxy would not even learn of for years. On the shrine world of Ephrael, cut off from all contact, the Sisters of the Order of the Argent Shroud made their last stand against a Necron tomb complex that had awoken beneath their primary cathedral, their prayers echoing unanswered in the silent void. The shadow of the Astronomicon was a shroud being pulled over the galaxy, and beneath it, mankind was dying. For Roboute Guilliman, the strategic reality was a nightmare from which he could not wake. His grand design, the Twin Crusades, was failing. Crusade Fleet Quintus was bogged down in a war of attrition it could no longer sustain. The Shadow Crusade of the Grey Knights and Custodes was lost, moving through a galaxy that was now almost entirely deaf and blind, their hunt for Faranek a search for a whisper in a silent hurricane. He stood before the golden throne, the flickering, dying light of his father's soul, a painful reflection of the state of his empire. The sheer, crushing weight of it all pressed down on him. The logistics, the strategies, the endless calculations of loss and acceptable sacrifice. He had been resurrected to save the Imperium, but he now found himself presiding over its slow, agonizing dissolution. He was the master of a dying empire, the last sane man in a galaxy sliding into the abyss. This was the true weapon of the Silent King. It was not the Gauss flares, nor the world engines, nor even the Noctilith crown. It was the silence itself. It was the slow, inexorable decay of logistics, communication, and hope. Zarek was not conquering the Imperium. He was allowing it to rot from within, to collapse under its own impossible weight. The cost of the war was measured not just in lives and worlds, but in the very concept of a unified human empire. The age of the Imperium was ending, not with a bang, but with the quiet final entry in a scribe's ledger. The galaxy was being balkanized, shattered into a thousand isolated pockets of humanity, each left to face the encroaching darkness alone. Hope, once the fuel of the Indomitus Crusade, was now the most precious and rarest of all commodities. In the deepening shadow of the Astronomicon, it was a resource that was about to run out completely. In the silent, crypt-like chambers of the Tower of Hegemon on Terra, a desperate council was held. The flickering hololith at the center of the room showed the stark reality, a galaxy fractured, bleeding, and dying. Lord Commander Guilliman stood with the two masters of his Shadow Crusade, Captain General Trajan Valoris and Supreme Grand Master Kaldor Drago. Their mission, the hunt for the Silent King's command locus, had been a failure. They were chasing ghosts in a silent sea, their every lead turning to dust as worlds fell silent before their fleets could reach them. The conventional means of intelligence gathering, astropathic intercepts, inquisitorial reconnaissance, psychic scrying, were all useless against an enemy who did not use the warp, and whose very presence smothered it. The scalpel Guilliman had forged was unable to find the heart of the enemy. "We are failing," Valoris stated, his voice a low, resonant bass that brooked no argument. His golden armor seemed to absorb the dim light of the chamber. "The Lord Solar buys us time with the blood of trillions, but it is a finite resource. The schism of Mars has broken our logistical spine. The Chronomaster's ire preys upon our fleets at will. We are fighting a war of reactions, and we are losing." It was Kaldor Drago, a being who had witnessed the infinite madness of the realm of chaos and survived, who offered the only solution left to them. It was a plan born of utter desperation, a final suicidal throw of the dice. "The enemy's strength is the silence he creates," the Grandmaster rasped, his voice echoing with the whispers of the warp he had endured for so long. He has blinded our psychers, but the silence itself has a source. It is a psychic void, a wound in the Imperium. A powerful enough psychic choir, focused with absolute precision, could perhaps follow that wound back to the blade that made it. The Fabricator General, present via a crackling, unstable data link from Mars, interjected with a burst of static-laced binary. The logic is sound, but the required psychic output would be monumental. The astropathic choir transcendent is shattered, its members either dead or insane. No such instrument exists. Then we will create one, Drago replied, his gaze unwavering. There is one group of psychers left in the Imperium with the power and the discipline for such a task, a group that has been held in reserve, shielded from the worst of the silence. A cold dread filled the room as everyone understood his meaning. He was speaking of the Ordo Sinister, the Psi Titans, the Warlord's Sinister class god machines, each crewed by a damned and lobotomized Alpha Plus level psyker, were the Imperium's ultimate psychic weapon, a horror so profound that their deployment was sanctioned only in the direst of circumstances. To use them not as a weapon but as a divining rod was to risk catastrophically burning out the souls of these living weapons, and possibly tearing a new hole in reality in the process. Guilliman, his face a mask of grim resolve, saw the terrible necessity of the plan. And who would guide this choir? Who has the will to focus such a maelstrom of power? We do, Valorous said, stepping forward. The Grey Knights will form the psychic conduit. Their minds, shielded by faith in 62 ritual wards, can contain the psychic backlash. The Adeptus Custodes will provide the anchor of will. Our very being is an extension of the Emperor's own indomitable purpose. We will hold the focus. And so, the desperate gambit was set in motion. In the dark, cavernous holds of the Custodes strike cruiser, Saul's vigilance, hidden in the deep void of the Kuiper Belt, the ritual was prepared. 10 full brotherhoods of Grey Knights, 500 of the Imperium's finest psyker warriors, formed a circle of shimmering silver armor. At their center, a conclave of inquisitorial psychers from the Ordo Malleus, their bodies frail but their minds furnaces of power, began the rite of ultimate scrying. And from the secret moon vaults of Titan, a single warlord sinister Psi Titan, the Somnus Est, was brought forth. It was teleported into the void nearby, its vast gothic form radiating a palpable aura of dread, its single, cyclopean eye glowing with trapped psychic lightning. Drago stood at the head of his battle brothers, his nemesis force weapon planted before him like a standard. Brothers, we are the hammer, the Custodes are the anvil. Let the soul of the witch be the fire. We will forge a path to the heart of this silent night. The ritual began. The Psi Titan's reactor was brought to full power, but instead of feeding its weapons, the energy was channeled into the Siracrux Anima, the arcane torture engine that housed the bound psyker within. A psychic scream of unimaginable agony erupted, not into the warp, but into the minds of the assembled Grey Knights. It was a tidal wave of pure, undiluted suffering, a hurricane of psychic force that would have atomized the soul of any lesser being. But the Grey Knights held. Chanting litanies of banishment, they absorbed the raw power, their silver armor glowing with a white-hot light as they struggled to contain and purify the psychic torrent. Trajan Valorous and 100 of his custodian guards stood outside the circle of Grey Knights. They were not psychers, but their will was absolute. They focused their entire being, every fiber of their transhuman existence, on a single concept, a target. They projected a psychic query into the maelstrom, being shaped by the Grey Knights, a demand for the location of the enemy's king. Their combined will was a golden spear of pure purpose, lancing into the heart of the psychic storm. The universe seemed to hold its breath. The inquisitorial psychers began to bleed from their eyes and ears, their bodies convulsing as they were consumed by the energies they had unleashed. The first Grey Knight fell, his armor cracking open as the psychic pressure became too much, his soul incinerating in a flash of brilliant silver light. Then another fell, and another. They were dying, sacrificing their very souls to maintain the conduit. And then they found it. For a single, infinitesimal moment, they pierced the veil of silence. They did not see a place but a concept, a throne at the heart of a celestial orrery, a king cloaked in silence, a location that was not in normal space, but hidden within the crushing, time-dilated gravity well of a singularity. It was a whisper of a location, a set of coordinates written in the language of dying stars and broken physics. Pharaonic. The moment the name echoed in their minds, the psychic backlash struck. The Psi Titan's bound psyker, its soul finally and utterly consumed, detonated in a wave of pure psychic agony. The remaining Inquisitors were turned to ash. Half of the Grey Knights were killed instantly, their souls snuffed out. Drago was thrown back, his armor blackened and cracked. The Somnus Est went dark, a dead, drifting hulk. The ritual was over. The cost had been catastrophic. An entire conclave of the Inquisition was gone. 5 brotherhoods of the Grey Knights, the galaxy's ultimate protectors, were annihilated. A Psi Titan was lost. But they had what they needed. Valorous, clutching the data slate that had recorded the fleeting stellar coordinates, looked at Drago. The Grey Knight was wounded, his spirit battered, but his eyes burned with a cold, hard light. The plan that formed between them was unspoken, instantaneous, and absolute. There would be no fleet. There would be no grand assault. Such methods would be detected and countered. This required a single perfect strike, a teleportation assault, a golden spear hurled through the galaxy, aimed directly at the heart of the Silent King's sanctum. It was a suicide mission on a scale that dwarfed all others, a final, desperate act of defiance against the encroaching silence. They would take the fight to the king himself or die in the attempt. There was no other choice left. The teleportarium chamber aboard the Custodes battle barge, gilded sarcophagus, was not a place of humming machinery, but a silent golden cathedral. Intricate patterns of circuitry were woven into the polished marble floor, and the teleportation array itself was a golden archway inscribed with the 1,000 names of the Emperor's victories. It was a machine of miracles, a relic capable of defying the laws of physics through sheer, indomitable will. Within this sanctum, the entirety of the Imperial strike force assembled, a gathering of heroes so potent that their very presence seemed to bend reality. At their head stood Captain General Trajan Valoris, his watcher's axe held at rest, his auramite armor a beacon of unwavering light. Beside him was Kaldor Drago, his storm shield bearing the scars of 1,000 demonic legions, the Titan sword humming with contained psychic energy. Behind them stood the survivors of the Great Ritual, 300 Grey Knights, their silver plates scoured and reconsecrated, and 200 Adeptus Custodes, the Emperor's own companions, each a demigod of war. It was a force that could have pacified a rebellious sector, and it was about to be wagered on a single impossible strike. The coordinates for Pharaonic were not a location in space, but a conceptual address within a gravitational anomaly. The tech priests and magi who manned the teleportarium had worked for weeks, their augurs and cogitators pushed to the very brink of mechanical failure to calculate the complex, non-Euclidean jump required. The risks were astronomical. A fractional miscalculation would see the strike force scattered into their constituent atoms across space-time, or worse, materialized within the heart of the black hole itself. Valorous looked at Drago, a silent question passing between them. The Grey Knight nodded once, his face set like granite. "The path is lit by faith," he stated, his voice a low rumble. "The Emperor protects." Valorous turned to his warriors. "We are the final shield and the last spear," he declared, his voice resonating with the absolute authority of his office. "We do not go to this place to conquer. We do not go to bargain. We go to deliver the Emperor's judgment upon the one who would silence his galaxy. Whatever the cost, the king must fall. For the throne." The roar that answered him was not one of rage, but of pure, unshakable resolve. 300 Nemesis force weapons and 200 Guardian spears were raised in a forest of gold and silver. The master of the teleportarium, a wizened tech priest whose body was more machine than man, made the final invocation to the Omnissiah and slammed his fist down on the activation rune. For a moment, there was nothing. Then reality dissolved. The warriors were plunged into a vortex of non-existence, a shrieking kaleidoscopic transit that was neither warp travel nor conventional teleportation. It was a journey through the fractured substrate of space-time itself. They felt the crushing weight of infinite gravity, the searing cold of absolute zero, and the maddening paradox of a timeless eternity passing in a single second. The faith of the Grey Knights and the will of the Custodes were the only things that held their forms together, a fragile bubble of order in a sea of utter chaos. And then, As suddenly as it began, it was over. They materialized not with a crack of displaced air, but with a silent inrush of reality. They were standing on a vast, circular platform of polished obsidian, suspended in a void. Above, below, and all around them was the impossible vista of the Silent King's command sanctum. It was a celestial orrery of captured stars and caged singularities, all held in perfect, silent orbits around a central throne of black stone. The light of dying suns cast long, cold shadows. The silence was absolute, a physical pressure that crushed the spirit and deadened the soul. They were inside the event horizon, a pocket of stable reality carved out of a black hole's throat, a testament to a level of technological mastery that bordered on godhood. Before them, on the dais, sat Zarek, the Silent King. He was not the towering, monstrous figure of imperial nightmares. He was a slender, regal form of living metal, his necrodermis shifting with the light of the captive stars. He was not alone. Flanking his throne were the other two members of the Triarch, Hapthetra the Radiant and Mesophet the Shadowed Hand, silent and still as statues. An entire phalanx of Triarchal Praetorians, the most elite of all Necron warriors, formed a silent, emerald-eyed cordon around the dais. The Silent King had known they were coming. The sheer psychic expenditure of the divining ritual had been an undeniable scream in his silent universe. He had not moved to stop them. He had waited. Zarek rose from his throne. No words were spoken. No challenge was issued. He simply raised his scepter of eternal glory, and the battle for the fate of the galaxy began. The Praetorians moved as one, their bodies blurring as they crossed the obsidian floor, their rods of covenant crackling with focused starfire. The Imperial strike force met them head-on, a thunderous crash of gold and silver against emerald and black. The clash was silent, for the sanctum absorbed all sound, but the violence was absolute. Custodes' guardian spears, wielded with the grace and strength of demigods, punched through living metal bodies. Grey Knights' nemesis blades, charged with the power of their pure souls, carved through Necron lords, leaving trails of incandescent white fire. But the Praetorians were relentless. For every one that fell, two more seemed to take its place, their fallen comrades already beginning to phase out, their forms dissolving into light to be repaired and returned to the fight. Valorous and Drago ignored the swirling melee, their eyes fixed on a single target, the Silent King. They charged towards the dais, a two-man spearhead of righteous fury. The Triarch moved to intercept. Hapthetra the Radiant, wielding a staff that blazed with the light of a captive nova, met Drago. The clash of their weapons was a silent explosion of pure energy, the holy power of the Grey Knight's faith against the cold, hard science of a star god's forge. Mesophet, the Shadowed Hand, melted into the darkness, his entropic touch reaching for Valorous' soul, only to be parried by a burst of golden light from the Captain General's armor. Valorous was a storm of gold, his Watcher's axe, a weapon that had tasted the blood of Primarchs and greater demons, rose and fell in unstoppable arcs. He carved a path through the Praetorian Guard, his every movement a perfect expression of the art of war. He reached the dais, his gaze locked with the impassive, glowing eye lenses of the Silent King. Here, at the silent heart of creation, the ultimate guardian of humanity confronted the architect of its extinction. Their duel was a conflict of fundamental forces. It was not a mere contest of blades, though the scepter of eternal glory and the Watcher's axe clashed with reality-shaking force. It was a battle of philosophies made manifest. The absolute unwavering will of a being created by the Emperor's own hand, a vessel of divine purpose and the belief in the sanctity of the soul, against the cold, perfect logic of a being who had sacrificed his people's souls for order and now sought to impose that order on the universe. Every parry from Valorous was a declaration that life, in all its chaotic, messy glory, was worth fighting for. Every strike from Zarek was a calm, logical argument for the peace and certainty of a silent, soulless existence. The captive stars of the orrery flared and dimmed with the force of their blows, the very fabric of the pocket dimension straining under the weight of their conflict. Around them, the battle raged, a silent, brutal apocalypse as the best of humanity fought the perfect soldiers of the Necron Tire in a battle that would have no witnesses and no survivors, only a victor. The duel between the King and the Guardian was a silent elemental storm at the heart of the universe. Zarek was a being of perfect, calculated motion. His every strike with the scepter of eternal glory was a flawless execution of martial geometry, aimed not at Valoris's auramite plate, but at the infinitesimal gaps in his guard, the predicted moments of weakness in his stance. He did not fight with rage or passion, but with the cold, irrefutable logic of a master equation solving for a single variable: death. Valoris, in contrast, was a tempest of golden fury. He fought not with logic, but with 10,000 years of battle instinct, honed in the presence of the master of mankind himself. His Watcher's axe was not merely a weapon. It was an extension of his will, a physical manifestation of his sacred duty. Where Zarek's attacks were precise, Valoris's were overwhelming, each swing carrying the weight of a divine mandate. Around them, the greater battle was turning into a desperate struggle for survival. Kaldor Drago was locked in a seemingly eternal conflict with the two remaining members of the Triarch. Hapthatra the Radiant was a being of pure energy, her form shifting and burning, while Mesophet the Shadowed Hand was a creature of absolute entropy, his touch withering and unmaking all it contacted. Drago was a rock in this storm of opposites, his faith a shield against both the blinding light and the consuming dark. But he was being driven back, his strength, vast as it was, beginning to wane against two beings who had fought in the war in heaven. The rest of the strike force was being systematically dismantled. The Necron Praetorians were a perfect, self-repairing wall of death. The Custodes, for all their individual prowess, were being overwhelmed by sheer, unrelenting numbers. The Grey Knights found their psychic powers dampened and suppressed by the Sanctum's null field, their greatest weapon rendered nearly useless. They fought on with blade and bolter, their silver armor stained and battered. But they were dying one by one, their souls extinguished in the silent dark. Valoris knew they had only moments. He saw the faltering line of his brothers. He saw Drago beginning to buckle, and he knew that this battle could not be won through martial superiority. It could only be won through sacrifice. He parried a devastating blow from Zarek's scepter that would have shattered a lesser warrior's spine, the impact sending shudders through his entire body. In that single fleeting moment of contact, he understood. He could not kill the Silent King. The Necron Lord's body was a vessel of near-invincible living metal, his consciousness capable of transferring to another form in an instant. The king was a concept, an idea, but the final command was not. It was a machine. Behind Zarek's throne, at the very center of the celestial orrery, pulsed a sphere of impossibly black energy. It was the master command node, the heart of the entire Blackstone network, the source of the silent resonance that was killing the galaxy. It was the true enemy. With a roar that was felt rather than heard, a psychic projection of pure, defiant will, Valoris broke off his engagement with the Silent King. He ignored the opening Zarek presented, a fatal error in any other duel, and instead launched himself forward, hurling his entire transhuman weight towards the throne. Zarek, for the first time in 60 million years, was taken by surprise. The move was illogical, a suicidal act of tactical madness. Valoris crashed through the Triarchal Praetorians guarding the throne, his axe clearing a path of shattered metal bodies. He vaulted over the throne itself, his golden form a streaking comet of purpose. Zarek turned, his scepter already glowing with the power to unmake Valoris from existence. But he was too late. With the last of his strength drawing on the light of the Emperor that resided in the core of his being, Valoris plunged his Watcher's axe not into the Silent King, but deep into the pulsating heart of the Master Command node. The effect was instantaneous and absolute. There was no explosion. Instead, there was an implosion of silence. The perfect, unnatural calm of the sanctum was shattered by a wave of pure, negative sound, an anti-scream that tore through both reality and the warp. The master node fractured, and with it, the entire final command network. Across the galaxy, every piece of Blackstone, from the pylons on Viridia to the Noctilith crown, resonated with a final agonizing harmonic of failure. The psychic cage that had been constricting around the Imperium shattered into a billion pieces. A wave of pure, raw psychic energy, the pent-up, tormented force of a wounded warp, erupted back into reality. On a million worlds, latent psychers who had been merely suppressed by the silence now had their minds and bodies torn apart by the sudden, uncontrolled flood of power. A psychic apocalypse swept the galaxy, a final, dying echo of the command's collapse. Billions perished in an instant, their souls burned out by the backlash. But it was not the end. The Astronomicon, which had been a guttering candle, flared violently, its light lashing out like a wounded beast before stabilizing. It was no longer the brilliant, galaxy-spanning beacon it had once been. The backlash had scarred it, wounded it deeply. It was now a pale, ghostly light, a faint ember in the darkness. But it was there. It had survived. In the Silent King's sanctum, the backlash was catastrophic. The celestial orrery flew apart, captive stars going nova, in silent, blinding flashes. The pocket dimension began to collapse in on itself, the gravity of the black hole reclaiming its stolen territory. The remaining triarchal praetorians were consumed by the collapsing reality. Kaldor Drago, seeing the final, desperate gambit, grabbed the wounded members of the triarch and, with a final, desperate exertion of his will, tore open a shimmering rift into the warp, a place that now, thankfully, existed again. He vanished into its chaotic embrace, his fate unknown. Trajan Valoris, his armor cracked and smoking, lay at the foot of the Silent King's throne, his lifeblood pouring from a dozen wounds inflicted by Sarek in that final, desperate moment. His mission was complete. He had broken the silence. He looked up at the Silent King, who stood impassively amidst the ruin of his grand design, the light of dying stars reflecting in his emotionless eyes. "The night is over, Xenos," Valoris rasped, his voice barely a whisper. Zarek did not answer. He merely watched as the Captain General of the Adeptus Custodes, the greatest hero of his age, finally succumbed to his wounds, his golden light extinguished in the heart of his enemy's collapsing sanctum. The victory was absolute. The final command was broken, but the cost was equally absolute. The strike force was annihilated, the Captain General was dead, and the galaxy they had just saved was now scarred, wounded, and screaming. The shattering of the final command was not a clean or quiet event. It was a messy, agonizing amputation, and the immediate aftermath was a symphony of chaos across a million worlds. The sudden return of the warp was not a gentle tide, but a tidal wave of raw, unprocessed emotion and psychic energy. On Viridia, the effect was apocalyptic. The Necron legions, their command protocols and reanimation abilities momentarily scrambled by the collapse of their master's network, faltered. For a precious few moments, their perfect phalanxes broke, their warriors standing stunned and disconnected, their green eye lenses flickering with error runes. The Imperial Guard, led by the indomitable Katerin Valerius, seized the opportunity with the ferocity of the desperate. "For the Golden Throne! For the Saint!" was the cry, as a million guardsmen surged over the top of their trenches, a tide of faith and fury crashing against a momentarily static wall of steel. The slaughter was immense, but for the first time, it was the Necrons who were being slaughtered. Without their reanimation protocols, they fell and stayed down, their living metal bodies shattered by cracked grenades and melted by meltaguns. Valerius herself led the charge of the Cadian 301st, her power sword a blur of light, her presence a blazing inferno of faith that drove her soldiers to acts of suicidal bravery. They overran the Necron lines, captured the silent monoliths, and planted meltabombs at their bases, shattering the Blackstone amplifiers one by one. The Necron overlord of Viridia, its consciousness reeling from the psychic backlash and the loss of contact with the Silent King, initiated a final desperate protocol: planetary harvest denial. Across the planet, the remaining tombs and pylons self-destructed, not in fiery explosions, but by sinking back beneath the ground, triggering massive world-spanning earthquakes that shattered the planet's crust. Viridia was saved from the Necrons, but it was left a broken, barren rock, its once fertile plains now a maze of seismic chasms and volcanic fissures. The Imperial Guard had won, but the world they had bled for was now just another dead globe in a galaxy of tombs. In the void, the situation was just as chaotic. Lord Solar Leontis, receiving the fractured, almost unbelievable reports of the Necrons' sudden disarray, ordered a general advance. Crusade Fleet Quintus, battered and low on supplies, surged forward, their weapons blazing. They found Necron fleets adrift, their systems struggling to reboot. The Imperial Navy, starved for a victory, showed no mercy. They tore into the disorganized Necron fleets, their macro cannons and lances finding purchase for the first time. Tomb ships that had once seemed invincible were hulled and gutted, their reactors detonating in silent green-tinged blossoms of light. The Chronomaster's ire, its temporal drives thrown into chaos by the sudden instability of local space-time, vanished in a flash of paradoxical light, either destroyed or thrown into a distant, unknowable point in history. It was a great victory, but a fleeting one. The Necron fleets, their systems recovering, began to execute calculated retreats, phasing out of reality to their hidden tomb worlds, leaving the Imperium in possession of 1,000 battlefields littered with the wreckage of both fleets. The balkanized galaxy did not heal. The islands of Imperial control remained isolated, their connections frayed and unreliable. The pale ghost light of the new Astronomicon was a comfort, but it was not strong enough to reunite the sundered whole. Fleets that had been lost in the darkness began to reappear, their crews half-mad from their ordeal, telling tales of systems that had fallen to xenos or turned to wholesale rebellion in the absence of Imperial authority. The schism of Zhao Arcad was not resolved. In fact, the logicians, seeing the failure of the Silent King's perfect logic, redoubled their efforts, now believing that only their own, refined version of soulless order could save the galaxy. Their hybrid fleets continued their war against the loyalist Mechanicus, a bitter, grinding civil war that would now bleed for centuries. On Terra, the news of the victory was received with grim, solemn silence. The sacrifice of Trajan Valoris and the entire strike force was a wound to the very soul of the Imperium. The Adeptus Custodes withdrew into the Imperial Palace, their grief a tangible, oppressive force. They would elect a new Captain General, but the loss of a hero like Valoris left a void that could never be filled. The Grey Knights retreated to Titan, their numbers decimated, their hearts heavy with the loss of so many of their brethren and the unknown fate of Kaldor Drago. Roboute Guilliman, standing alone in the Sanctum Imperialis, felt no triumph. He had won. He had saved the Imperium from immediate extinction, but the empire that remained was a shattered, broken thing. He had traded a quick death for a slow one, a final silence for an eternity of screams. The shattered front was a testament to his Pyrrhic victory. The Necron network was broken, but the individual dynasties were not. The Imperium had survived, but it was weaker and more divided than at any point since the Horus Heresy. The immediate aftermath of the climactic battle was not a time of celebration, but one of desperate consolidation. Broken armies retreated from dead worlds. Battered fleets limped back to fortified star systems. The Imperium, like a man who has survived a grievous wound, was left to lie in the dark, bleeding from 1,000 cuts, listening to the sounds of wolves gathering in the night. The war against the silence was over, but 100 new wars were about to begin in its chaotic, bloody wake. The echo of the final command's failure was not one of relief, but of agony. The sudden, violent resurgence of the warp was like a starving beast being unexpectedly released into a feast. For months, the Immaterium had been leached of its emotional sustenance, its demonic denizens weakened and tormented by a creeping, unnatural starvation. Now, with the dam broken, the flood of raw, untamed psychic energy that washed back into their realm was intoxicating, maddening, and it drove them to a singular, unified frenzy. The psychic death scream of billions of latent human psychers, their minds detonating in the backlash, was the dinner bell for a feast of unparalleled scale. In the eye of terror, the great game, that eternal, intricate dance of betrayal and conquest between the four chaos gods, ceased. For the first time since the fall of the Eldar, a purpose united the ruinous powers, a shared terror and a burning, incandescent rage. They had felt the approach of the silent extinction, the cold, logical threat of a universe devoid of the passion, rage, despair, and ambition upon which they fed. The anathema on the golden throne was an enemy they understood, a foe locked in an eternal struggle with them. But this silent king, this soulless machine, had offered them a glimpse of true oblivion, a final death of absolute nothingness. Their reaction was a primal, instinctual lashing out against the mortal galaxy that had birthed such a threat. Their new great game was simple, total and utter annihilation. They would burn the galaxy to cinders, rendering it into a chaotic, screaming ruin, ensuring that no mortal mind would ever again conceive of a weapon that could starve them. The first blow fell upon the Cadian Gate, or what was left of it. The worlds around the now vast cicatrix maledictum, already reeling from the great rift's birth, were overwhelmed. Warp storms of unprecedented violence erupted, no longer just tears in reality, but gaping, bleeding wounds. From these wounds poured the legions of the damned. Armies of demons, numberless and insane with hunger, materialized in real space, not bound by the usual constraints of ritual or summoning, but simply boiling out of the raw stuff of chaos. Worlds that had survived the fall of Cadia and the Great Silence now fell in a matter of hours. The Imperial garrisons, exhausted and cut off, were swept away by tides of screaming plague-bearers, blood-drenched corn berserkers, and shimmering, reality-warping horrors of Tzinch. But this was not just a random outpouring of demonic rage. It was a coordinated invasion. From the depths of the maelstrom, Lorgar Aurelian, the Urizen, the first and most devoted servant of Chaos Undivided, saw his moment. He had watched the Silent King's gambit with a scholar's interest and a zealot's horror. Now, with the Imperium shattered and the warp in a state of violent flux, he unleashed the Word-Bearer's Legion in a new dark crusade. Their mission was not to conquer, but to corrupt. They fell upon the isolated islands of the new Imperium, not with armies, but with apostles. They preached a new gospel to the desperate, abandoned masses. The Emperor was a silent, distant corpse god who had failed them. The true gods were the ones who answered, the ones who offered power in the face of oblivion. On 1,000 worlds, cults of despair and ambition took root, a spiritual cancer that spread faster than any fleet could travel. The rage of the gods was not limited to the followers of the corpse emperor. The Eldari, who had watched the Great Silence with a mixture of terror and grim satisfaction, now found themselves a prime target. The great enemy had not forgotten their ancient trespasses. Slaanesh, having felt the near extinction of its most potent food source, focused its terrible singular desire upon the craft worlds. Masks of demonettes and hosts of fiends poured from hidden webway portals, not to conquer the ancient vessels, but to turn them into palaces of exquisite agony. On the craft world of Saimhan, a demonic incursion of such scale and depravity was unleashed that the wild riding clans were forced to scuttle entire sections of their world ship, consigning millions of their own people to the void to prevent the cancerous spread of the Prince of Pleasure's taint. Even the silent zones, the areas of space still becalmed by the remnants of the Blackstone resonance, were not safe. They became eerie, unnatural battlegrounds. Here, demons found their power waning, their forms unstable, but they pushed on, driven by the furious will of their masters. Imperial forces fighting in these zones found themselves in a bizarre, nightmarish war where demons would flicker and fade, their swords passing through them harmlessly one moment, only to solidify and tear a man limb from limb the next. The laws of reality were frayed, and in the space between the silent order of the Necrons and the screaming chaos of the warp, a new kind of madness was born. This was the wounded beast's roar. The victory over the Silent King had not ushered in an era of rebuilding. It had merely thrown open the doors to a new, more terrible asylum. The threat of a silent, soulless extinction had been replaced by the promise of a screaming, chaotic damnation. For the battered remnants of the Imperium, it was a horrifying realization. They had fought and bled and died to preserve their souls, only to find that their souls were now the primary target of a hungry, enraged, and unified pantheon of dark gods. The whispers of a new war were not whispers at all. They were a deafening, galaxy-wide scream of pure, unadulterated hatred, and a promise that the suffering had only just begun. In the tumultuous years following the shattering, the Imperium found itself engaged in a new, grimly familiar type of war, the Scouring. It was not a crusade of glorious conquest, but a desperate, brutal campaign of reclamation and punishment. Lord Commander Guilliman, now ruling over a fractured ghost of an empire, was forced to become a butcher and a fireman, directing his depleted forces not in grand strategies, but in a series of desperate holding actions and punitive strikes. His primary objective was no longer expansion or even preservation, but the cauterization of the Imperium's 1,000 bleeding wounds. The first front in this new war was against the remnants of the Necron presence. Though the Silent King's grand network was broken, his armies were not. Individual tomb worlds and entire dynasties, now disconnected from Sarek's central command, began to act on their own ancient pre-programmed directives. Some simply returned to slumber, their mission of galactic silencing a failure. Others, however, awoke to find themselves surrounded by the chaotic, verminous life of the 41st millennium and reacted with cold, xenocidal fury. The war for the Orpheus sector, a region that had been heavily seeded with Blackstone nodes, became a charnel house. The Maynarch dynasty, infamous for their flare virus curse and their insatiable hunger for flesh, began a systematic consumption of the sector's human population. Entire worlds were harvested, their people not killed, but rendered down into biological slurry to feed their dynasty's terrible curse. The Imperial fists, their numbers bolstered by Primaris reinforcements, were dispatched to halt the tide. What followed was a grim attritional siege war fought amongst the ruins of hive cities and the charnel pits of dead worlds. Sieges that lasted for decades became the new norm, with both sides too stubborn to retreat and too powerful to be easily destroyed. The second, and perhaps more bitter front, was the war of consolidation against the Imperium's own fractured elements. The Age of Shadow had given birth to 1,000 petty empires. Worlds cut off from Terra for years had declared their independence, fallen under the sway of charismatic demagogues, or reverted to pre-imperial barbarism. The Lord Solar, Leontis, his crusade fleet Quintus now repurposed as the Imperium's Iron Fist, was tasked with bringing these worlds back into the fold. It was a thankless, soul-destroying task. He did not fight xenos or heretics, but human beings who had been abandoned by the Imperium and now resisted its return. On the hive world of Sebasti, the ruling council, who had successfully fought off a Drukhari invasion during the Silence, refused to pay the imperial tithe, declaring their world a sovereign power. Leontis was forced to order a full-scale planetary assault. The Cadian regiments who had bled on Viridia now found themselves storming trenches manned by men and women who were, by all rights, loyal subjects of the Emperor. It was a war of heartbreaking necessity, a brutal reminder that the Imperium was held together not just by faith but by force. Each reconquered world was a victory that felt like a defeat, its people sullen and resentful, its infrastructure shattered. The most vital and desperate campaign, however, was the scouring of the logicians. The civil war within the Adeptus Mechanicus had become a festering wound that threatened the Imperium's ability to wage any other war. Zhao Arcad had become the heart of a new, silent mechanicum, its hybrid fleets preying on loyalist forge worlds and vital supply convoys. Mars itself, now a fortress world cut off from its own empire, finally unleashed its full, terrifying might. Legions of Scutarii, cohorts of the Collegia Titanica, and entire maniples of the cult Cybernetica were dispatched on a holy war to reclaim their lost territories. The war between the two factions of the machine cult was a conflict of terrifying technological escalation. Scrap code and logic bombs crippled fleets without firing a shot. Abominable intelligences forbidden for 10 millennia were unleashed by the heretics of Zhao Arcad. In response, the loyalists of Mars unsealed the ancient vaults of Moravec, unleashing weapons that warped reality and erased matter. The war for the soul of the Omnisia was burning away the very technological bedrock of the Imperium, each victory costing the victor irreplaceable knowledge and ancient sacred machinery. This was the new reality of the Age of Shadow. The grand galaxy-spanning conflicts were over, replaced by 1,000 smaller, yet no less brutal wars. The Imperium was an exhausted giant, its limbs still flailing, trying to stamp out the fires on its own burning body. Guilliman, Leontis, and the other leaders of humanity were no longer generals planning grand campaigns. They were triage surgeons, trying to decide which limbs to amputate to save the dying patient. They consolidated their power, abandoning entire sectors that were deemed untenable, fortifying core worlds into impregnable bastions, and sacrificing the periphery to the encroaching dark. The process of scouring and consolidation was not a glorious reconquest. It was a managed retreat, a slow, agonizing contraction of the borders of humanity, a painful admission that the age of the Imperium was truly over, and a new, darker age of isolated survival had begun. The silent war left behind no triumphant monuments, no glorious annals of victory, only a legacy of dust and silence written across a shattered galaxy. The Imperium of Man, the colossus that had bestrode the stars for 10 millennia, was irrevocably broken. It survived not as a unified empire, but as a constellation of fortress segs and fortified subsectors, huddled around the faint, ghostly light of a wounded astronomicon. The Age of Shadow was its new grim reality. Trillions were dead, worlds beyond count were lost, and the very concept of a galaxy-spanning human dominion was relegated to the realm of myth and memory. The High Lords of Terra still ruled from their ancient thrones, But their edicts were now whispers in a hurricane, their authority extending only as far as the fleets of the battered Imperial Navy could project it. A new feudalistic order arose, with powerful sector lords and chapter masters ruling their domains as independent kings, paying lip service to a distant terra they could barely contact and no longer truly served. The legend of Caterine Valerius, the saint of the dying light, became one of the few unifying forces in this fractured age. Her improbable victory on Viridia, a beacon of faith in an era of despair, was canonized by the ecclesiarchy. She became Saint Caterine, the shield of the faithful, and her image, that of a simple guardswoman holding a blazing rosarius against a tide of soulless machines, became a potent symbol of human endurance. Pilgrimages were launched to the shattered, dead world of Viridia, now a holy site, its barren plains a testament to the power of faith to defy even the most logical and absolute of dooms. Her Cadian 301st, elevated to the status of a living relic, became the core of a new order of crusaders tasked with defending the holiest sites of the new, smaller Imperium. Roboute Guilliman, the avenging son, found his role transformed. He was no longer a regent or a lord commander. He was a mythic figure, a wandering king from a lost age, forever moving between the isolated bastions of humanity. Aboard his flagship, the Macragge's Honor, he became the Imperium's last true unifying element, his presence shoring up a crumbling sector, his strategic genius snatching a vital system from the jaws of a xenos invasion, his very existence a reminder of a time when the Imperium was whole. But he was one being, and the fires were a million. His was a lonely, eternal vigil, a penance for a victory that had cost him his father's dream. The silent king Zarek did not see his grand design as a failure, but merely as a flawed first attempt. From a new hidden throne, he observed the galaxy he had inadvertently created. His final command had failed, but in its failure, it had achieved what 60 million years of slumber had not. It had broken his ancient rival, the chaotic and vibrant Imperium of man. It had shattered their fleets, sundered their communications, and crippled their faith. The isolated dead zones, the silent patches of reality left by the broken Blackstone network, became the seeds of his new empire. He initiated the Silent Conquest, a new strategy of slow, inexorable expansion. From these silent zones his legions would emerge, not in grand fleets, but as silent creeping tides of silver. They would conquer the isolated human worlds on their borders, adding them to their silent domains, their populations harvested or simply erased. It was a slower, more patient conquest, but one that faced a fractured, disorganized, and utterly exhausted foe. In his failure, Zarek had perhaps found a more certain path to his ultimate victory. The Chaos Gods, their rage sated for a time, retreated to their realms to digest the feast of souls the backlash had provided. The great game resumed, but it was now played with a new, frantic energy. They had glimpsed their own mortality, and it had made them desperate. Their incursions became more frequent, more violent, their goal no longer just conquest, but the total spiritual saturation of real space, a final definitive victory over the cold, silent logic of the material universe. And so, a new balance of power settled over the grim darkness of the 42nd millennium. It was not a balance of empires, but of extinctions. The choice for the galaxy was no longer between order and chaos, but between two different flavors of doom. There was the slow, creeping, silent death offered by the expanding Necron Empire, a future of absolute order and soulless dust. And there was the screaming, agonizing, chaotic death promised by the resurgent, ruinous powers, a future of eternal torment and laughing, thirsty gods. Humanity, huddled in its scattered fortresses, was trapped between these two encroaching apocalypses, its guiding light dimmed to a candle's flicker. The silent war was over. The legends, glorious and damned, had been forged. But the ultimate legacy of the war was not one of victory or defeat. It was a single, terrifying truth that now hung over the galaxy. The end was no longer a distant possibility, but an imminent certainty. The only question left was what form it would take.